There are ways of stepping up and challenging Putin, but still controlling the escalatory ladder. And we need to get into that mindset, and we're not there yet.
Columnist Claire Fergus argued that staying neutral should come at a cost and suggested we reconsider the millions of pounds we give to countries like India and Pakistan in foreign aid. Joining me now to discuss the matter in more depth are Jamie Shea, a former NATO official and now Professor of Strategy and Security at the University of Exeter, and Tobias Ellwood, Conservative MP for Bournemouth East and Chair of the House of Commons Defence Select Committee. Welcome to you both. Welcome back, Tobias. Nice to have you again. Neutral. Can you be neutral at this point, Tobias?
No, thank you for inviting me, and Jamie, good to see you. This is a race against time. I think Putin will only remain in power as long as he has support from parts of the international community. We've done an incredible job in providing a scale of sanctions, which means that the Russian people recognize there's no return for Russia to the international stage with Putin in charge. But until then, how much mayhem can he inflict on Ukraine? Part of that will be as to what NATO does in response. Part of that will be how Ukraine defends itself. And part of that will be as to how many other countries choose to actually give him a lifeline, such as China, such as India. So they can play a crucial part in recognizing what Putin has done and that it's time for him to go.
Jamie, just last Thursday, Pakistan's Prime Minister Imran Khan was in Moscow for talks with President Putin on a major gas pipeline deal and regional issues, including Afghanistan. Do we have to be sympathetic to national interests? Or, as I asked at the beginning, is it possible at all to be neutral in this particular conflict?
I'm not in favour, Mariella, and by the way, good afternoon to you and also to Tobias once again. I'm not in favour of a one-size-fits-all approach. I think the West has to be shrewd in its diplomacy here. Take the case of India. Obviously, it's regrettable if India is a major arms importer from Russia and abstained in these votes. But on the other hand, Joe Biden has worked hard with India over the last couple of years to draw India into the so-called Quad four-power arrangement for the Indo-Pacific, which of course is an important element in pushing back against China. So I think that sophisticated diplomacy is going to be required to some extent. But of course, what really matters is making sure that these countries, even if they remain neutral, do not help Putin to circumvent the sanctions. And I think the threat of secondary sanctions on them is going to be key. For example, as you know, just yesterday, Jake Sullivan, the US National Security Advisor, met his Chinese counterpart in Rome to make it very clear that the US would take a very dim view if China abandoned so-called neutrality and started to export drones or weapons to Russia that it could use in Ukraine. Just one final thing, again, arguing for a little bit of sophistication here, together with firmness. Take a country like Serbia. It's applied to join the European Union. It's negotiating to join the European Union, and yet it's refused to impose sanctions against Russia, unlike Montenegro, its neighbor, which is also applying to join the European Union. So I think that clearly, where a country wants to join the Western club, it should start to implement Western decisions and live up to Western values.
So on the one hand, you're arguing for sophisticated diplomacy, but on the other, the sort of lack of sophistication that comes with the carrot or the stick, doesn't it? Reuters reported yesterday, Tobias, that Russia has offered India the chance to buy oil and other commodities at discounted prices, an offer that's being considered by New Delhi. Do we have much room for manoeuvre on situations like this, Tobias? Because ultimately, you don't want to push India to a position where they have to make a fundamental choice and might choose Russia, do you?
Yeah, I mean, this is the bigger picture that's playing out here. We've not picked up on this. I hope the penny is now dropping. This is not just about Ukraine, but about the potential development of an axis between Russia and China that will affect our security, our geopolitics for the next couple of decades. And India will need to ask itself which side of history perhaps it wants to be on. It does have a relationship ever since it gained its independence with Russia, but that relationship is with Russia itself, not with Putin. And so Jamie's suggesting that we need to be more shrewd. We need to exhibit, I think, more perhaps Cold War statecraft in recognizing how we can actually turn the pressure on Putin himself and not the actual Russian people. This is the way that we need to go forward.
But Jamie, I mean, this axis between Russia and China has been developing for some time. Is it something we should have been concerned about before now? And is it what's giving Putin license to behave as he is with impunity?
I think, yes, we should have been concerned about this before now. There was a kind of feeling that because the two had a bromance in the early 1950s at the time of Stalin and Mao Zedong, and then quickly fell out as to who was going to be, if you like, top dog and who was going to be the junior partner, that this would immediately bedevil Russian-Chinese relations again, particularly with Putin obviously not wanting to become subservient to China. I think that was a false assumption, and I think we are seeing that we need to regret that now, because China has given a great deal of at least verbal diplomatic support to Putin, particularly criticizing NATO and blaming the whole thing erroneously on NATO enlargement. On the other hand, from my talks with Chinese diplomats, I get the feeling that they're highly embarrassed about all of this. They're very wedded to the principle of state sovereignty and non-interference. They've offered to mediate, although that hasn't really sort of kicked in yet. And of course, as we were saying in response to your first question, the Chinese have to ask themselves if they really want to hitch themselves to Putin's wagon at a time when he's recklessly trying to smash the international order, because China very much depends on this trading system. And China has even more to fear than Russia from the kind of draconian sanctions on banks and financial transactions, investments, Western private sector that Russia's experiencing at the moment. So what Jake Sullivan is doing, what he did, I mentioned in Rome yesterday, which is clearly trying to sort of put down red lines for Chinese behavior in this crisis, I think is important. It's no guarantee that China will detach itself from Russia, but I think we need to sort of try to exploit any sign that there may be a possibility there. We don't want these two authoritarian powers forming some kind of new geostrategic axis in the 21st century.
Indeed, and that must be something that particularly concerns you, Tobias. And is the hope just that they have very different approaches and therefore might not want to combine strengths?
No, I mean, I hope I'm wrong, but I for a long time believed that this is going to be China's century. There's talk that China might itself implode, but President Xi has been very, very shrewd himself in advancing his own country, in exploiting our wobbly international rules-based order. This century, they are likely to challenge the United States economically, militarily, and technologically for dominance. And if they have Russia on board as well, then that offers a geopolitical challenge between two spheres of competing interest. And this is why what happens here in the next few months and so forth is absolutely critical. If Putin is seen to win in Ukraine, it will have a long-term consequences for European and indeed global security as these fault lines then become far, far clearer. So we need, as I say, far better statecraft, far better determination in standing up to Putin and supporting our Ukrainian friends, and also a recognition that our peacetime defense budget of 3%, of 2% is woefully inadequate. We need to move to that 3%.
Tobias, do you think we should be going further? I mean, obviously there have been calls endlessly from Ukraine for a no-fly zone, and explosions took place very close to the Polish border just the other day. Should NATO be feeling under threat?
Yes, and it's right that they bolster and shore up NATO areas of concern, the alliance itself. But ultimately, like I say, this isn't just about Ukraine. It's much, much more than about Ukraine. Putin is playing on our timidity, recognizing that we may say things, we'll even rule out what we won't do, but we won't stand firm to help Ukraine in the way that we should do. The one thing that Putin actually fears is the utility of NATO. And our response every time a significant initiative is mentioned is the fact that we can't pursue it because it might lead to nuclear war. Well, that's simply too simplistic and plays into Putin's objective to, in fact, intimidate us. The world's a very different place today, but we're still, as I say, in peacetime mode. There are ways of stepping up and challenging Putin, but still controlling the escalatory ladder. And we need to get into that mindset, and we're not there yet.
Tobias, what are those ways? I mean, not giving countries who remain neutral foreign aid money is a suggestion, but that doesn't feel like a particularly, honed tool.
Well, firstly, what scale of genocide, what level of war crime do we need to actually watch from afar before we say, yes, we need to intervene? and step up and
But
do
how would
this.
that intervention look? That's the $1 million question, isn't it? What would intervention be? Would it be going to war against Russia?
Well, firstly, you get the legal top cover. You go to the UN General Assembly, bypassing the United Nations Security Council, and you create a safe haven, let's say in the west of Ukraine potentially, or all of Ukraine, to say that it would be breaching international law if this war then continued. That's not requiring any policing. Secondly, you would actually bolster your support for Ukraine itself. The fact that those MiG-29s from Poland were denied was completely wrong. That should have been moved across. And that, again, showed how risk averse we've become. We speak about chemical weapon attacks taking place. I suggest that's probably going to take place. What support are we providing the Ukrainians, not just to protect themselves with masks and protective gear and so forth, but other ways to actually what sort of equipment has been used? If a nuclear power station is to be attacked, again, that would have a consequence. That's arguably because the consequence of that would see some form of spread right across, as we saw with Chernobyl, to the west as well. Like I said, we're not even willing to test the lines of working out where Putin will back away from, because we're letting him give the space for him to expand. Putin will not stop until he is stopped.
Jamie, do you agree? And going back to the discussion about nations deciding to remain neutral. I mean, if you look at the list of them, all of them have national interests in terms of energy, or I mean, there is a national interest there. So should we understand it, or should we be penalising them in order to try and bring them round so that the force against Putin becomes stronger?
Right. My agenda here. Number one, maintain the coalition that we have. We've built up over the last couple of days, particularly on the back of outrage against Putin's invasion, this enormous coalition. I mean, even the Swiss, who normally stand on the sidelines, are implementing the EU sanctions against Russia. Asian countries have joined in, many others around the world. So the first thing is to maintain that coalition, because those sanctions are not going to produce miracles immediately. They take time, and we can't have countries sort of dropping out, particularly if suddenly Ukraine disappears off the front pages of the newspapers. Not likely at the moment, I grant you. So that's the first point. Number two, be very clear about what the conditions are for removing sanctions. We don't want certain countries to say that a temporary ceasefire in Ukraine is a good excuse already to remove the sanctions. We've got to be crystal clear about what the conditionality for that is. Number three, yes, and Tobias mentioned this, and I agree, if we're back to the Cold War circumstances, we're going to have to make some pretty tough choices. For example, a couple of years ago, we were condemning Saudi Arabia for the murder of Jamal Khashoggi, or for what the Saudis were doing exactly in Yemen. But now, of course, so we need Saudi oil. Similarly with the UAE. The Americans have even sent a delegation to Venezuela to speak to Victor Maduro about supplying more oil. These are not very nice choices, but it's the lesser evil in order to confront the greater evil. Finally, criminalize Putin and his regime. The UN General Assembly, I agree with Tobias there, could set up a special tribunal for the Russian crimes in Ukraine, similar to what we had for Yugoslavia a couple of years back. And the more those indictments hang over the heads of Putin and his regime, the more difficult it is for them to travel, the more they become persona non grata, the harder it is for people to give them time and to deal with them. So there are elements of a strategy here. I also think that we need to help the Ukrainians in the most intelligent way we can. I disagree with Tobias on a no-fly zone. I don't think it's a good option. I do agree with him, however, on the MiG-29s.
And
so I didn't just come back there. I didn't. I avoided the no-fly zone. My concern about that one was the fact that we declared so openly, yes, we're not going to do it. And I would suggest keep your cards close to your chest.
Yes,
I think too risky later.
Sorry, Jamie, I didn't. Can you repeat that? Oh, I think we've lost Jamie. Listen, that was really, really fascinating. Thank you both so much for your thoughts on neutrality and much more besides. Tobias Ellwood, MP for Bournemouth East, and Jamie Shea, former NATO official. Thank you both for joining us today. Coming up.